Hello, Amy.
Hi, Anne. How are you?
Well, let's introduce ourselves to the Blogging Heads audience. I'm Ann Althouse at the University of Wisconsin Law School and the blog Althouse.
And
you are?
Amy Sullivan, and I'm a contributing writer with Time Magazine. And we are doing an all women and politics Blogging Heads today because there is plenty to talk about just with that topic. And
is it all going to be focused on Obama and the new Ron Suskind book that has some interesting information about Obama's so-called women problem?
Well, that's most of what I had hoped we would cover. But I think it's also worth getting into the question of women voters in the Republican primaries. Actually, I was digging around yesterday, and I'll bring up when we get to that what I found in terms of the data. But it's kind of amazing that there's been very little written about what women voters think of the Republican candidates. And, you know, even though they tend to lean slightly Democratic, in last year's congressional elections, more women voted for Republican candidates than Democratic candidates. So it's still definitely relevant, and yet there's been little to no analysis of what women think, which we could say might not be surprising. But
well, we always think of the Republicans as being the one that have a problem with women, but there's been a lot of focus on Obama having a woman problem. How would we define the sort of issue?
Well,
I'm not ready to admit that he has a women. Wait, just language-wise, do we want to say a woman problem or a women problem?
Well, definitely women.
Or female trouble is another expression.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to use that one. He has a women problem, very different than Bill Clinton's women problem. But yeah, I'll get into this because I wrote a piece for Time last week about it. And in the piece, I said that I've been noticing this actually since the beginning of the administration. And as someone who was probably more inclined to hope that this was going to be an administration where women would have a fair amount of say in policymaking and political advising, it was kind of disappointing. I was just actually, after the first 100 days, flipping through some pictures in the White House Flickr account. Because they had put up an album of the first 100 days, and I am a total sucker.
And can I just insert? Those are the pictures they chose. They must have thousands of pictures for.
It's true. Yes.
And only pick a few. So this is the view of themselves that they wanted to present.
It is.
Or this is the best that they had. Maybe they had nothing with more women in it. But so you're finding like just a lot of men in suits.
Well,
not enough women?
I was flipping through at first just looking for pictures because I love looking at behind the scenes White House things. Although, as you say, it's a carefully cultivated look at behind the scenes. But was struck about halfway through that there were shot after shot after shot of Obama in the Oval Office and Obama in meetings around tables. And it was all the same guys in suits. And maybe occasionally Valerie Jarrett, or maybe Christy Romer in one shot. But it was just overwhelmingly male. And, I had already been hearing stories about how male the group around Obama was, with Gibbs and Axelrod and Plouffe, and just, the guys from the campaign who kind of bonded, and how tough it was for women to break through. And that's where we should get to what you were talking about in terms of what to call this and how to define it. Because there's been a lot of discussion about whether this is sexism in the White House, or, Anita Dunn used the phrase hostile work environment.
Right.
And that tends to conjure up, images of guys hooting at their female colleagues or telling inappropriate jokes or, overt sexism, kind of the Mad Men days. But I don't think that's what's going on.
Sometimes it's the women interpreting things.
Whether
I'm sorry,
or not.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say sometimes it's the women interpreting things as having sexual content when they don't really have them. The notorious example being the first time Christina Romer met Barack Obama. He said something that Ron Suskind accepts as being a sexual expression when it really isn't. The monetary policy has shot its wad. I mean, Christina Romer imposes a sort of pornographic image on that. But in fact, as I blogged about this, in fact, as many people pointed out to me, it's not sexual. It's a reference to shooting a musket, and that when you run out of ammunition, that the package that you've been holding the musket ammunition in is called a wad, and when you shoot your wad, you're using your last. You're at the point where you're just using the bag that the ammunition came in as the substitute for ammunition, and that means you're just all out of ammunition.
Right.
That's all it means. And Christina Romer thought, wow, that's weird for a man to first talk to me saying something sexual. And Ron Suskind, in his book, adopts it as a, salty language. That was unusual. But in fact, it just doesn't have sexual meaning, and the meaning was imposed on it. So what do you make of women looking at evidence and putting it onto and imposing a template where who's the one with the problem? I mean, you could be looking for trouble and see things as, it's because I'm a woman. There's an issue here having to do with gender. And, maybe a lot of, I don't know who's been through women's studies classes and who hasn't, but a lot of women are educated and trained to impose a gender template on things. And, it's the old problem of if that's your tool, then everything looks like the thing that tool is applied to.
Yeah, well, I think there are two different things going on here. One is what you're talking about, and there is some of that going on. I spent a lot of time looking into why there are so few women in opinion journalism, and particularly within the ranks of opinion political journalism. And, I'll talk to women who complain about guys throwing footballs around the office or talking about sports scores. And I always think that's ridiculous because I love tossing basketballs around the office, and have found that the fact that I actually genuinely love sports gives me a way to talk with my male colleagues. But even if I didn't, I would find a way to relate to them, and they're not doing it specifically to try to exclude female colleagues. It's just something, if you like it, you talk about it with other people who do.
And also, sports is perfect small talk. You can get just the right amount of excited about it, and it doesn't really matter. So the stakes are low, yet you can be passionate. So it's really good for camaraderie. Yeah. And a lot of women, instead of thinking, oh, this is the way women are excluded, if they just got a little up to speed on a little bit of sports, I recommend the Milwaukee Brewers, for example, and the Green Bay Packers. I'm out here in Wisconsin.
Or the Detroit Tigers.
Well, that's the enemy, Michigan.
Oh, that's my home team. Well, we will not get into sports then because I'm just plugging so much.
But I mean, if you would just have a little facility, and if you didn't, I don't want to just come and blame women, but just advice for women. There's a path you can go down. There's a template you can choose where you see women as being excluded. And then you go into a passive-aggressive mode, and you get the other women together, and maybe you have meetings. And the women at the White House did this, and you put interpretations on things that you're being excluded, rather than looking for more positive, aggressive instead of passive-aggressive things to do to try to become included. And I would think, especially in the White House, where you have these super aggressive men who are jockeying among themselves for position, the idea that they're going to step back to let the woman have a chance, I just don't see why you would expect that to happen. And going into passive-aggressive grousing, meeting with the women about the problem, and then confronting the president, which is what they did, I just don't see how that is going to be effective.
Okay, well, here's where I disagree with you.
It's a woman problem template is itself part of the woman. It's part of the problem. So, you can come at the problem from the men have a problem or the women have a problem. I mean, I think it's helpful to try to solve one's own problems in a more positive, aggressive way. Especially when you get at the top of a pyramid of power where there are very few people with access to the president. The idea they're going to let you in just because you're a woman and more women are needed in the pictures, in the optics. I just think the president shouldn't have that kind of a burden that he can't deal with the people that he wants to deal with, and that he has to step back and include this other matter. It just seems impractical for someone with that much responsibility to have to deal with that.
Let's separate two things here, though, because while I agree with you that women can be oversensitive in the workplace, and read too much into things. I do think there's something going on in this White House. And if you talk to most of the women who were involved here, and if you look at, say, Anita Dunn, who's been in Democratic politics for decades, she knows how male-centered it is. She's been in a lot of testosterone-heavy environments, and she thought there was something different here. What most of the women are complaining about is not salty language, it's not sexist behavior, it's being excluded, not even purposefully. It's
right. I understand that.
And
I
here's
understand
the type
that,
of
but
thing that it does make sense for somebody. And in this case, Valerie Jarrett was the one who first started to raise it with Obama, and he only met with the women when he kept kind of putting her off and saying, "Oh, it's not a big deal." But what she was trying to raise with him was the fact that, you know, he likes hanging out with the young guys in the administration. He likes playing basketball with them and talking fantasy sports with them. And again, that's something that he has fun with, but the practical effect of it is that if you're a young guy in the White House, you have a much better chance of getting close to the president, who, after all, is the only boss in the White House who matters, than if you're a young woman. And it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, Condi Rice and Bush used to talk about football and watch football all the time.
Right.
And yet, that's not how it operates.
So Bush did not have the same problem.
No, he didn't have the same problem.
Let me approach it.
And I just wanted to bring up an example here that maybe can show why it doesn't just apply to the White House.
Well, let me make it clear that I'm not saying it's just that women are oversensitive and there's not really a problem. When I was saying that, I was speaking in terms of when there is a problem, how should women deal with it?
Right.
What's the best way to untangle that problem and move forward? Is it a passive-aggressive meeting with other women and then confronting the president about his woman problem, or is it something else? Now, but I want to approach it from the direction also. I mean, there's one way in which I'd like to talk about this, which is the extent to which it is a problem that the women have and can try to solve from their side. But I'd also like to talk about the way why Obama himself has gotten to the point of having this problem or perceived problem, to whatever extent it really is his problem.
Sure.
And I think the contrast to George Bush, who didn't have the problem, is an important one. How is Obama a different sort of person, a different kind of politician than George Bush was? I'd like to try to get into that. I mean, for example, you could say this is a boys' club. What makes a man a boys' club man? Why does that happen? What's the dynamic there? What do we know about Obama? How could we try to analyze that?
Yeah.
I mean, if I were a historian 20 years from now looking back on it, trying to figure it out, I think this would be an interesting lead to try to, the psychological history of this president. Obviously, he had an unusual life. He had an unusual path and a very quick path into the presidency. How did he do that? Why did he have that? The first thing he did after law school was write his autobiography about his missing father, a man who was raised by a strong woman, as George Bush was also raised by a strong woman, chooses to write about the man who wasn't there, the father. He's searching for a father. Who were the other male figures? How did he get boosted up and lifted up by, I'm guessing, various men in the course of his soaring career? Who were the men that got him there? He's the face of a set of men who moved him there. There's an Obama dynamic to that already excludes women. He's built on that platform. And from what I gather in the Ron Susskind book, there were a few men, two in particular, Rahm Emanuel and Larry Summers, who were extremely aggressive, dominant men who were, fighting for their closeness to the president.
Right.
How did that dynamic get into place in the first place?
Right, but let me just go on a short tangent for a second and look at Rahm Emanuel, who I actually think has gotten some unfair blame on this subject. Because Rahm is a guy who had in the House a female chief of staff. He had at the DCCC a female chief of staff, same thing at the White House. He has had no problem working with strong women, and strong women have had no problem working with him. And this is certainly a guy who is no stranger to salty language. And it kind of puts the lie to the idea that you have to check yourself when you're working around a group of women, or that women won't be comfortable in a place where there's strong language. I think Rahm has shown that he is very comfortable with women taking leadership.
Well, I'm not talking about strong language. I'm talking about strong ambition, where people are trying to hoard as much power for themselves as they can get. And Emmanuel and Summers seem, if I'm believing the portrayal in Susskind's book, they were very, very aggressive. And it's not that they have a problem with women, although maybe Summers does. It's not. I'm not saying that it comes across that they have a problem with women, just that they're concerned about their own success in amassing power by getting close to the president.
Right.
And that has a collateral effect on the women that they don't care enough about. And asking people like that to step back and tone it down and make room for the women is you can understand why that wasn't very successful.
Right. Well, and it's kind of the grown-up equivalent of asking boys in school to raise their hands instead of shouting out their answers.
Right.
Women are socialized to follow the rules, and you have meetings. You bring everybody in on a memo. You don't go secretly to the boss to make your case without bringing everybody else into it. And it can be a shock to come into a working environment where some people don't follow the rules, and it turns out they win by not following the rules.
Right.
Because
Let me read a little passage from the Susskind
Sure.
book that's exactly on that point, that many of the women felt that the men, namely Summers and Emmanuel, didn't play by the rules. The group of women even coined a term for these transgressions, policy fouls. That Summer and Emmanuel circumvented traditional policy rules and often left other key players out of the loop would alone have been cause for frustration, but when this was coupled with Obama's guy-to-guy attitude and the testosterone aggression that accompanied these fouls, women in the White House found themselves increasingly frustrated and feeling worthless. I felt like a piece of meat, Christina Romer said said of one of the meetings where she'd been deliberately boxed out by Larry. Now, Larry Summers meeting. So notice, I felt like a piece of meat. That's old feminist talk for saying I was made into a sex object.
Yeah,
but there's
I
no
think that was
sex
a
object
misuse.
content to that. It just means she felt that she didn't count as a person.
Yeah.
Because these other human beings were asserting their personhood and filling all the space, and there was nowhere left for her. And it was just this, and you notice the expression testosterone fueled. If the same kind of hormonal terminology was used against women, it would be considered unacceptably sexist.
Yeah.
Like if women are trying to do something because they want it as a matter of personal will, if you say, oh, it's the estrogen speaking again or something like that, it would be just unacceptable. You'd be rejected. But women are able to say, oh, it's testosterone fueled. This is about maleness. And I felt like a piece of meat, as if these men who are so engaged in their own aggressive game are going to notice that she's not speaking and say, oh, okay, Christina, what do you have to say?
Well,
I mean,
let's talk about
it's funny
both
that
halves of
that's
that then,
portrayed
because
as a woman problem as opposed to an aggressive, willful politico issue where some people are stronger players than others.
And willing to change the rules. And you're right that complaining about that, certainly in most cases, and definitely in this case, doesn't work for women. Obama's response, even at the dinner where the senior female aide sat down and talked to him, was basically toughen up and deal with this, which is, the traditional
What else could he have done?
Well,
now, it was interesting that dinner was scheduled on the day that turned out to be the day of the Fort Hood massacre.
Right.
And Obama held the dinner anyway. And it was kind of, the speculation would be that this was so important, he had to do that. But why wasn't he more focused on presidential work? He was having a dinner with a bunch of women who were aggrieved by something that they were perceiving, and he went through this ritual of being a good listener, which was something that he did. But he said, I really want you guys to talk to me about this openly, because recently there's been this suggestion that there are some issues here. I'd like to know how you guys feel. In other words, he's playing the good listener. He's I don't know.
Yeah, I actually read that as the fact
of
that he went ahead and had the dinner anyway might have been proof that he didn't really take it that seriously, and it wasn't going to be much of a drain on him. But let's go and concentrate on the second half, because we've talked about ways that women can not help themselves and not necessarily make it worse, but certainly not make it better for themselves. But the place where I do think there's something here is Obama's need for these guy interactions. And here I just wanted to raise a quick example. When I was in grad school, before I blessedly dropped out of my PhD program, some of the male professors in the department started holding a weekly poker game. And there were only like 5 guys out of the 75 students in our department. But they invited the male students to join the poker game, and some of the male husbands of some of the female students in the department. And then would, reference the things that had gone on at the poker games in class. And some of the women complained about it. I think for good reason. One, I happen to like playing poker. And, I did get the chance to say, no, I don't want to be part of your poker game because I was never even asked to be part. But the biggest thing was they were giving the male students a chance to form this informal bond outside of the classroom and outside the department that they didn't even offer female students the chance to have.
Where was this? What year was this in what place?
This would have been in 2002, and it was in Princeton.
Pardon me while I laugh, but that is really pathetic. 2002 at Princeton? I mean, if you'd have told me it was 1972 at the University of Michigan, where I was long ago, I might have believed that, but that's pathetic.
But, it wasn't something that they were doing maliciously. It wasn't something that they thought were excluding women. It just never even occurred to them. And I think that's the case with Obama.
Why doesn't that occur to them?
Occurred to him.
Well, that's what I'm saying is pathetic, that it doesn't occur to them in 2002 at Princeton. I thought that elite males had heard all about this feminist analysis and this unconscious exclusion of women. I mean, I just won't give them a pass. I can't believe they didn't know what they were doing. These are not stupid people. These are Princeton professors. This is the elite of the elite. How is that explained? How is that justified? That strikes me as just crazy.
But it's not very different from inviting male members of Congress and male cabinet secretaries to play basketball and not inviting, Kathleen Sebelius, who played college ball, not inviting Stephanie Herseth, who played in high school and college. There were women who weren't even given the chance to say, no, I don't want to really shoot around on the court with the president.
Right. Yeah, and I agree that all of that is a problem. This informal access, the golf and so forth, if the president needs his downtime and he needs his relaxation time, and the truth is he feels relaxed among men. He's a guy's guy or something like that. What makes a man like that as opposed to a man who would feel comfortable watching football with Condi Rice?
Well, I think it's worth asking about Obama specifically, and I'd love to hear your psychoanalysis on that. I also think it's a broader problem. I've run into this more times than I would care to with guys of my generation. And I admit I had kind of thought this was something that would die out when you got past.
Do you think it's possible that among elite, highly educated, highly intelligent men that they think that the issue has already been worked through?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe at this point in history, the problems have all been solved and it's up to the individual women to basically compete within the system they've been given access to.
Yes.
And they don't need any special paternalistic care, and it would be maybe insulting to offer it to them. Well, or they've just gone blind again. I mean, maybe there is a tendency among men to want to have their relaxing downtime among men, and once they feel that they've got enough points in the, obviously you're on the right side of feminism chart, that they can then revert to doing what they just naturally feel like doing, and then we get to see what that is, as opposed to being vigilant and making a point of getting some pictures of them, playing basketball with women.
Right, because often these are guys who would be described as kind of sensitive metrosexual guys, and yet who are obviously more comfortable around women or men, and who can be made uncomfortable just by very kind of small neutral things that women may do that are different from what they do. I can think of times when I've talked to male bosses and, just for instance, had to mention that my grandma had died and so I was going to a funeral. Wasn't looking to get a hug or to cry on somebody's shoulder, just had to say, I'm going to be out of the office for 2 days. And the look of pure panic that crosses a male boss's face of, oh my God, she's going to lose it. She's going to start crying. I don't know what to do. Was really insulting, actually.
Well, it's interesting that you combine that with the idea of the metrosexual man as opposed to the sort of, John Wayne, Rick Perry, kind of very manly man. We're talking about Obama is not that sort of man. He's more on the metrosexual side. We've seen him dancing on the Ellen Show. He has a kind of a graceful, lanky body, not a muscle bound sort of an attitude. He has an easy, graceful attitude, a kind of a personal style that some people might say metrosexual, but it's not hyper masculine. Sort of right in the middle. But I wonder why, what connection that has to this maybe concern that they don't want to, that they do want to be around other men, or that they want to have their maybe masculinity bolstered up by being surrounded by other men. Do you think that there's anything like that?
That's a good question.
I think it's just a matter of personal comfort, really. I don't think that there's any. I think it's interesting that he's not hyper masculine in appearance, even though he's reached this highly most powerful man in the world. So it's interesting that someone who doesn't have a sort of hyper masculine presentation becomes the most powerful man in the world. Although I think that he did it by having other really willfully powerful men putting him as the face of a group who was trying to achieve power. I don't know what that says about comfort in various kinds of sports and downtime activities, but it seems like, I don't know. There's also the issue of the absent father and the fact that after he got his credentials at law school, putting him in a position to become extremely powerful, that what the activity he was drawn into was kind of personal journaling.
Personal journaling, but also, community organizing, which again was not...
Well, that was before he went to law school, of course.
Oh, you're right.
After, right. People get that chronology wrong, don't they?
Yes.
I think people conventionally, I'll bet if you survey people, most people would think after law school, he went into community organizing. But it was the other way around.
Right.
And after law school, he went into writing his reflective book about his absent father, in which, his father was absent, his mother was present in his life, and he wrote the book about searching and actually getting dreams from the absent father, where the mother who put her life into raising him was kind of an absent figure in the book. There's some interesting sexual politics to all of that, the sort of psychosexual profile of Barack Obama. There's something to be delved into there. But he found other men. And he found his way toward power very quickly through other men, not through women. Why did that happen? How did that happen? That's my big question.
Well, I try to stay away from speculation, but you've just raised something that I can't avoid stepping into, which is, it's possible often people who have never really known at all one parent kind of idolize them. In this case, his writing about his father was a way of working through who was this man. But they also kind of only have one parent to blame for things. And he's talked in interviews about the complicated feelings he has about his mother. The fact that, she basically sent him back to go live with his grandparents and pursued what was the best thing for her in terms of her PhD work and in terms of living in Indonesia. And how, that can be tough on a child and it can make you feel not wanted. And I'm sure that shaped his thoughts about women as much as it led him to think about his father and what could have been with his father. And that would give him, a complicated view, not just of women in general, but of powerful women. And whether he was inclined to think of them kindly or not.
What else is absent in the book? The story of how he fell in love with his wife, how he formed a relationship with his wife. We're told that they get together and they do marry, but it's almost a blank in the book. It's not explained. And we don't hear about other girlfriends either. We don't, who are his other relationships? Who are the other women that he had before Michelle? It's not in the book. We never hear about it. We don't see these women coming forward and talking about it. He really is kind of a man surrounded by men, even though Obviously, women love him. They almost act like he's their boyfriend. I have a long time tag in my blog called Obama the Boyfriend that I use when people portray Obama as a boyfriend. And Obama himself sends out email, that has a subject line as if he's your boyfriend. I got one yesterday with the subject line, "If I don't call you." And another one is, "Will you have dinner with me?" And it's like I got email from the boyfriend, Barack Obama.
Yeah.
I think that's a little strange.
Well, but to be fair, in the book, he also doesn't talk a lot about male friends. I mean, it really was very internally focused on himself and his personal journey. I don't think he was excluding female friends.
But I think it's that it's not, the book isn't just about him. There are other people in the book. I think that, and I mean, how did he become president of the Harvard Law Review and then go on to the kind of position he had with advance on the book and being able to teach at Chicago and getting an offer without really ever doing any scholarly writing? How did he move from that and then very quickly into politics and vault right to the front of the pack? How was that done? I mean, I still wonder about that. I think that was done with men seeing in him the beautiful face of what they didn't have. He had something they didn't have, which was the outward presentation that was so appealing. And it was especially appealing to women. But it didn't come from women. It came from men. So the power flowed through men. And these men were able to put his face on the front of their power. And women loved that face.
Right,
but then when women got the jobs,
getting into politics or getting into an academic job would be more likely to find men in a position to put them into power than women in that position. So while I do think there could be a narrative there, it's not as if he chose not to pursue relationships with female mentors and was drawn.
Well, so there's a passivity to that. I mean, one of the things that the women in the White House complained about was that if the problem was Summers and Emanuel's, it was still Obama's problem because he put him there. He was relying on them. I think this was a high-ranking female official said the idea of a boys' club being just Larry and Ron really isn't fair. Obama was just as responsible himself. So if he passively let them, if they channeled their power through him and he was this passive channel, he was still responsible for that. The idea that he didn't really set out to exclude women, it just happened by virtue of things that happened through him. He's obviously responsible for that.
Right.
He should have noticed that. And people did point it out to him. And he sat there and listened and then said, but you know what? I need Larry and Ron.
Yeah. Well, and the description that Susskind has of that dinner is interesting, that the women kept talking about Larry and Ron, but they really meant Gibbs and Axelrod because they were the biggest problems. But they were scared to bring up those names because they knew Larry and Ron were important advisors to him, but Gibbs and Axelrod, those were his buds. And they knew he's not going to do anything but defend those two. And in fact, might get mad at us for, pointing this out about them. And so the women didn't even, when they had him in a room, have the guts or the ability to point out the real source of the problem there. And in fact, I would point out that things have gotten better since Robert Gibbs left the White House.
It's a fascinating dysfunction of things said and unsaid. What did you think of the part where Christina Romer is upset that she's not being included in a discussion, and instead of just butting in, she writes on a business card, if you don't include me soon, I'm going to leave, or something to that effect,
I think for her it was a combination of being a woman in an economic shop that was so dominated by men, and not just men, but men like Larry Summers, who is an equal opportunity bull in a china shop. He'll run over anybody. It doesn't matter if you're a woman.
Right,
but also, she was coming from the world of academia. She really had very little, if any, involvement in the world of politics before. And she was just shell-shocked. This was a culture that she was not prepared for at all. And I think that explains her response as much as anything. Although I was shocked by one of the anecdotes she told of, pushing back against Obama in a meeting about the size of the stimulus. and having him just break from character and yell at her and tell her, we have discussed this, stop bringing it up, that is it, I am not talking about this anymore. And then a few days later, Larry Summers making the same suggestion, and he very calmly listens to Larry make his points, and then says very calmly, I hear you, but that's not the direction I want to go in. And having that actually be so overt as to get through to Summers, that there's a difference in how Obama listens to Romer and
That's
to Summers.
Infuriating. That it really is infuriating. But to hear someone else say your idea and get treated much more, like when you said it was just stupid and you should have shut up, and they just give you looks like, why are you saying that? Whereas then when the man says the same thing, the idea might not be accepted, but he's treated with respect. And then you really see what the hidden prejudice is. Can I bring up a separate issue on the gender politics that I noticed in the book? One of the things I found most fascinating was during the campaign, they had a discussion where they were trying to come up with a jobs plan. Of course, that is the big issue today. They were having a discussion about the 10 million low-skilled male workers and what could be kind of a centerpiece of a policy plan. This was as they were doing the campaign. And one of the ideas that came out was healthcare workers, nurses, aides, companions to seniors, hospital orderlies, and that they could have a program of channeling these low-skilled, out-of-work males who were a big problem in the economy into those health service jobs. And Obama says, look, these are guys. A lot of them see healthcare, being nurses' aides, as women's work. They need to do something that fits with how they define themselves as men. And so that was kind of un-PC and sort of shocking. And then, as the discussion went forward, what they came around to is what Obama is still talking about today, infrastructure, rebuilding infrastructure. And he's all, that's manly, that will help men find their identity. So he was very concerned with masculine psychology. He felt something there about the men. Now, what I think is interesting is once he got into power, there was this huge stimulus. And at first they started talking about rebuilding all the roads and bridges, all this construction. But then what happened to the stimulus didn't go there. And now we're back in 2011 talking about how now the bridges are falling down and we need to build them. Let's have a new stimulus and let it be about infrastructure.
Again.
What happened to the original plan, which he talked about during the campaign, being about infrastructure? And I really vividly remember a New York Times op-ed written in December of 2008, so before he was inaugurated, by Linda Hirschman, that was critical of the stimulus plan that was emphasizing construction and jobs that would be for men, and that if there was a job stimulus plan, it needed to include, this is a quote, jobs in fields like social work and teaching where large numbers of women work. So that you had to include, you can have just a male-focused stimulus. And so that was a really important dynamic going into the campaign, getting elected, proposing a stimulus, and then having it not be about men, not being about rebuilding the male unemployed, which Obama had specifically wanted to focus on and had empathized with male identity and men's work as opposed to women's work.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because last winter after the State of the Union address, I listened to Anna Greenberg talk about some focus groups she had done during the speech and about how women reacted so negatively to every mention of infrastructure because they hear it the same way that Obama intends it. They hear infrastructure and they think construction jobs. They're looking to put men back to work. I don't hear anything about me. I'm out of work too. I want a job for me, not just a job for my husband. And that's one practical consequence, I think, of not excluding women, but keeping women out of the inner circle or not being as close to women. Certainly Valerie Jarrett has a very important role in Obama's life, but it's not a policy and a political advisor role. And I think a woman there would highlight this and would say, guys, it's important to be reaching out to those male voters, but you don't want to lose your female voters at the same time.
Well, but I want to suggest that he was right the first time and that the unemployment problem actually is much more severe with males, and it's a deep social problem that affects males and females. And the idea of equal stimulus for social workers and teachers was actually a bad idea, and the original idea building some tangible things where we'd be spending money on stuff that we would then have, roads and bridges, and that it would well, I don't know, maybe this is a little retrograde, but return feelings of self-worth and manliness to men with men's jobs.
But is there a reason that
so
you
troglodyte?
can't...
It was Barack Obama who said those things and who deeply cared about them back in 2008.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was probably right to be thinking that way, but also needed to be focused on what can we do for women who are out of work as well. And, in last November's election, 49% of women voted for Republican congressional candidates and 48% voted for Democrats, which hadn't happened in 30 years. And the number one reason that women gave for voting for Republicans over Democrats was the economy. And that may just be blaming the party that's in power. But I also think they're looking for something that they're not hearing from the White House and from the Democratic Congress.
But if the stimulus is about buying votes for Democrats, it is absolutely corrupt.
Right. But it doesn't have to be
It should be
one
about...
It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Well, I mean, the way you just presented it to me, I think, is an indictment of the corruption of the Democrats. That money is not for buying re-election for Democrats. If that's what that money is for, the Republicans are right to say...
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that Democrats often have an edge because they are seen as having a better hold on the economy. And if the economy is doing better, this is kind of what you're saying is the flip side of the argument Republicans are making, that we should make sure the economy keeps tanking because that way it'll be good for us and people will blame.
I'm saying that if you're
Obama.
going to use economic stimulus as a tool, it should be oriented to the real economic problems and not re-election concerns.
Absolutely,
right? So
but it's the way you talk about
it. If the jobs problem is really, one diagnosis of it is it's disproportionately male, and that and that we also need to rebuild the infrastructure. Those two things fit together in a nice synergistic way that Obama himself saw and campaigned on. He was then unable to follow through on it because he got some political pushback from women, or I'm theorizing that that's why he didn't use the original stimulus to build the roads and bridges. And if that was really a good theory to begin with economically and looking at the social structure, the gendered imbalance of wealth in the country, and a psychological problem that he saw in men. And remember, he campaigned on hope and change. He was going to inspire us. And if part of that inspiration was to rebuild masculine pride in their masculinity, well, he didn't follow through on it.
I would be shocked if the reason he ended up changing the stimulus was because of pushback he got from women. But we need to move on to the question of Republicans and women because we're running a little short on time here.
Okay.
And I think this is a particularly interesting question given the fact that we do have Michelle Bachmann, who, at least at the beginning of the summer, was being talked up as a potential frontrunner for the Republican nomination. And we have the perennial question of whether Sarah Palin will get in. I continue to believe that she will not get into the race. But we have women in the Republican electorate kind of all over the place in terms of which candidates they're supporting. And I don't actually find that surprising. What I do find surprising is that no one seems particularly interested in what women are looking for in the primary, because we know when we get to the general election, there will be lots of talk about potential gender gaps and what do women want, which candidate appeals to them. But it would seem to me there would be some room for a candidate here to start talking about what appeals to women. They are a not insignificant part of the GOP electorate, and yet we've heard virtually nothing about them so far this campaign season.
I think that Republicans are much more likely to see men and women, blacks and whites, et cetera, as all individual human beings, and that you can talk to everybody in a neutral way across the board. You don't have to have special tidbits in there for women or right. I'm not surprised that the Republicans don't identify some special female issues to proceed with.
Right, and yet Sarah Palin has spent much of the last 3 years talking about mama grizzlies and talking up the fact that Sharon Engel should be, one of the female standard bearers of the party, like her. And the woman.
Well, that's yeah. That's not talking about issues that will make women voters think this candidate is offering something.
No. But it's a kind of identity politics that we haven't heard in the Republican Party.
Stepping up and pursuing power in the same way that a man would. I think it's interesting that if you look at the statistics, males and females, with respect to Bachmann and Palin, that those females are more popular with males than with females.
Yes.
Men love Sarah Palin.
Yes, they do. In fact, I've got a CNN poll here. And actually, Rudy Giuliani, who is not in the race, gets a higher percentage of the female support here than Michelle Bachmann, slightly less than Sarah Palin. But Mitt Romney and Rick Perry were getting large portions of the women's support, at least as of late August.
Yeah, are you seeing a serious gender imbalance with respect to any of the candidates? Or is it evenly distributed?
It's pretty evenly distributed, actually. The only thing that's somewhat surprising is that, someone like Michelle Bachmann, who talks in every chance she gets about being a mother and about being a foster parent, ways that might perhaps be seen to reach out to more socially conservative women who would appreciate someone who is walking the walk. Doesn't seem to translate to sport.
I think it's healthy that if there is not a gender imbalance, if males and females are attracted to the different candidates in roughly the same proportion. If Michelle Bachmann likes to point out that she's been a foster parent and that her concerns about children, obviously, shouldn't we want to say, men are parents too? Children are of concern to males and females. And if Republicans are showing more of a gender balance in their attraction to issues relating to parenthood and children, isn't that more progressive than an imbalance where the women think it's their special concern to look at children?
Sure. Well, she has definitely spurred her male opponents to mention how many kids they have in debates. I think it was the first one that started to get into the realm of the ridiculous, with them competing to say how many kids and grandkids they had, and then Ron Paul talking about the thousands of children that he had given birth to, and that was game over. He wins. Thousands of kids. Well, maybe you're right.
Well,
that's why
children are important. I think it is a kind of a proxy for saying traditional values.
Yes.
And it might have a little bit of an unspoken cue about abortion. I have children. I didn't have abortions. Or I love children. I'm against abortion. Obviously, the connection, anyone who supports abortion rights doesn't like that connection, but it's a subtle kind of signal or cue to viewers that this is, we love babies, which should be an uncontroversial point.
Well, family itself means different things in different political contexts, and you're right. When it's a Republican candidate talking about families, the subtext is pro-life, pro-traditional values, pro-traditional marriage. When Democrats talk about family, it's interesting. It's almost always in the context of poor families. And they know that it's not politically palatable to constantly talk about the poor. So they talk about being pro-family as a way of getting at talking about poor.
I think the basic divide there is that the Republicans are signaling personal responsibility. Parents raise children. And we support the family. Basically, you take care of your own issues individually, economically within the family unit, whereas Democrats are more signaling towards saying we need social programs, we need to spend money to help those people who can't help themselves. So it's got a paternalistic
or community responsibility would be the more positive spin on that. But
wait, I had trouble hearing that word. What was it?
Community responsibility would be.
Yeah, it takes a village.
Yes. Well, thank you, Anne. This has been really interesting, and I'm so glad we could take this time to talk about the Susskind book, because that, for my money, was one of the most fascinating things to come out of it.
I need to go off and do some more blogging about all of this. Looking through the book with a special eye toward all the issues with women, there was a lot of fascinating material. So it's a good book, too. There's a lot more in it. That's actually not the main subject of the book, if people are thinking of buying. It's got a lot of
not at all, but it was very smart of him to put that in there, because
do you think we were being female by reading the book for its female content and ignoring the vast majority of what was in the book, which was economic policy?
Oh, I certainly haven't ignored that, but I've been waiting for a chance to write this piece, and then he went ahead and did it as a chapter in his book, so I'm glad to be able to piggyback on it.
Hey, Amy, do you remember that you and I were the first both females on
I know.
Blogging Heads? The first time they had two
that
females.
Was 2006. How crazy.
But now it's like a big thing. They're always trying to match up women on Blogging Heads. So
we broke the glass ceiling there. And
yeah, but the gender studies of Blogging Heads is something one could say a lot of interesting things about. The whole pairing women with women and women doing women's issues, or issues being designated women's issues and so forth.
Yeah.
Why is gender a women's issue?
I would love to talk women's issues with a male colleague at some point. That would be fun, blogging it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we did this, and let's do it again.
Okay.
Take care.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.